What if the destiny of nations, the lives of millions, and the very course of the 20th century could be traced back to a single document signed in the dead of winter? On the 18th of December, 1940, such a document was issued by Adolf Hitler. It was known as Führer Directive 21, but its chilling codename would echo through history: Operation Barbarossa. This directive was not merely a set of orders, it was the formal blueprint for a monumental and audacious gamble, a plan to invade and crush the Soviet Union in a single, lightning-fast campaign. The document's opening declaration laid bare its staggering ambition, stating with cold certainty that the German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, Operation Barbarossa, even before the conclusion of the war against England. This was a strategy of immense risk, committing Germany to a colossal new war in the East while its conflict with the British Empire in the West was still raging. To achieve this, the directive commanded the army to employ all available units, a total mobilization of its strength, with the sole reservation that the already occupied territories across Europe must be adequately secured against any potential surprises or uprisings. The grand purpose of this vast undertaking was defined with terrifying clarity. The primary objective was not the capture of territory for its own sake, but the complete and utter annihilation of the Soviet military power in the field. The directive specified that the mass of the Russian army in Western Russia is to be destroyed in daring operations by driving forward deep armored wedges. This tactical language painted a picture of a new kind of warfare, one of speed, shock, and encirclement, designed to prevent the Red Army from executing its most potent defensive strategy, a strategic withdrawal into the endless expanse of its own territory. The plan was explicit in its goal to ensure that the retreat of units capable of combat into the vastness of Russian territory is to be prevented. By trapping and destroying the bulk of the Soviet forces close to the border, the German High Command believed it could achieve a decisive victory before the campaign could bog down in the unforgiving Russian landscape and climate. Following this envisioned initial destruction, a rapid pursuit was to be launched, pushing ever deeper into Soviet lands. This second phase had a clear geographical objective: to establish a secure line from which the Soviet Air Force could no longer pose a threat to the German Reich. The ultimate goal was to establish a defense line against Asiatic Russia from a line running approximately from the Volga River to Archangel. This AA line, as it would become known, represented a strategic barrier, a continental wall intended to permanently separate European Russia from its vast Asian heartland. Should this line be achieved and any pockets of Soviet industrial power remain, the directive had a final, ruthless contingency. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, would then be tasked with the systematic elimination of the last industrial area remaining to Russia, a region presumed to be in the Urals, thereby crippling any residual capacity for the Soviets to wage war. This monumental plan did not spring into existence overnight. Its genesis began months earlier, in July of 1940, under the preliminary codename Operation Otto. The meticulous military planning continued for months until, on the 5th of December 1940, Hitler reviewed the final proposals and gave his formal commitment, setting the wheels of war irrevocably in motion. The issuance of Directive 21 just 13 days later was the final, formal command that translated strategic intent into operational reality. The directive was precise, outlining not only the goals but also the timeline for preparation. All preliminary work that required significant time was to commence immediately, with a clear deadline for completion set for the 15th of May 1941. Hitler retained personal control over the final trigger, specifying, "I shall order the concentration against Soviet Russia possibly 8 weeks before the intended beginning of operations." Throughout the document, one theme was paramount: absolute secrecy. The success of the entire operation, predicated as it was on a swift and overwhelming surprise attack, depended entirely on deception. The directive stressed this point with the utmost gravity, stating, "It is to be considered of decisive importance, however, that the intention to attack is not discovered." Every movement, every logistical arrangement, and every order had to be masked, disguised as routine training exercises or troop rotations to lull the Soviet Union into a false sense of security. The directive also functioned as a master plan for coordinating the different branches of the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht. While the army was the central instrument of the land invasion, the Luftwaffe was assigned a critical supporting role. It was tasked with releasing such strong forces for the Eastern campaign in support of the army that a quick completion of the ground operations can be counted on.
A secondary but vital mission for the Air Force was defensive, to ensure that damage to Eastern German territory by enemy air attacks will be as slight as possible. Interestingly, the directive revealed the strategic priorities of the Reich by clearly delineating the role of the Navy. Even as this colossal land war was to be unleashed in the East, the main effort of the German Navy was to remain unequivocally directed against England. This clause underscored the reality that Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a rapid, decisive campaign that, once concluded, would allow Germany to once again focus its full might against its British adversary. The military and strategic planning, however, was supplemented by a far more sinister element. On the 30th of March 1941, the operational orders were infused with a brutal ideological mandate known as the Barbarossa Decree. This decree fundamentally transformed the nature of the coming conflict.
It declared, in no uncertain terms, that the war against the Soviet Union would not be a conventional struggle between professional armies governed by the established rules of warfare. Instead, it was to be a war of annihilation. This ideological framework stripped away any pretense of military chivalry, setting the stage for a conflict of unprecedented ferocity and cruelty, where the lines between combatant and civilian would be deliberately and systematically erased. The meticulous military planning of Directive 21 was now fused with an ideology of extermination, creating a truly terrifying vision for the coming storm in the East. Have you ever tried to imagine the sound of history being broken? On a quiet Sunday morning, the 22nd of June, 1941, the world witnessed just that, as the largest and most powerful invasion force ever assembled in the annals of human conflict was unleashed. This was the dawn of Operation Barbarossa, the moment Nazi Germany and its European Axis allies began their colossal invasion of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It was an offensive of such breathtaking scale that it would forever redefine the meaning of total war, opening a theater of unprecedented violence and destruction that would rage for 4 long years. The sheer magnitude of the force gathered for this single purpose was staggering. More men, more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft were committed to this one offensive than had ever been deployed before in a single military operation. The invasion force was a testament to the industrial and military might of the Axis powers. An immense host of more than 3.8 million troops surged across the border, advancing along a sprawling front that stretched for an incredible 2,900 kilometers, or 1,800 miles. The core of this military behemoth was the German army, which had allotted almost 150 divisions, containing a total of about 3 million men, to the campaign. This represented a staggering 75% of the entire German military, a commitment that underscored the absolute centrality of this operation to their strategic ambitions. This formidable German contingent was not alone. It was joined by approximately 650,000 troops from Germany's allies, Romania and Finland, swelling the ranks of the invading army. The mechanical and logistical power supporting this human wave was equally immense. The Barbarossa force rumbled forward with about 3,000 tanks, a steel fist designed to punch through enemy lines, supported by the deafening roar of 7,000 artillery pieces. Overhead, the skies were dominated by 2,500 aircraft, tasked with clearing the way for the ground assault. Even in an age of mechanization, the operation relied heavily on traditional means of transport, with a logistical train that included 600,000 vehicles and, remarkably, more than 600,000 horses, a detail that speaks to the sheer logistical challenge of supplying such a vast army over such an enormous distance. The launch of Operation Barbarossa on that June morning marked the opening of the Eastern Front of the Second World War, which would become the largest and most brutal theater of war in the entire conflict. The surprise was absolute. Nearly 4.5 million troops launched their attack, catching the Soviet leadership completely off guard and finding the Red Army in a dangerously unprepared and partially demobilized state. The initial impact was nothing short of catastrophic for the Soviets. Within a single devastating week, the German forces had penetrated 200 miles into Soviet territory, a lightning advance that shattered the front lines. The Soviet Air Force was decimated on the ground and in the air, with nearly 4,000 aircraft destroyed before they could effectively counter the invasion. The human cost in those first few days was equally horrific, as some 600,000 Red Army troops were killed, captured, or wounded in the initial onslaught. This offensive was not merely a battle. It was the largest and costliest military operation in human history.
The opening phase alone involved around 10 million combatants locked in titanic clashes across the vast plains of the Western Soviet Union. The violence and destruction were on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. By the time the operation officially concluded on the 5th of December 1941, the casualties had reached a number that is difficult to comprehend. The German war machine, despite its initial stunning successes, had suffered immensely, with close to 775,000 casualties. But the toll on the Soviet Union was beyond catastrophic. More than 800,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed in the fighting, and an additional 6 million had been wounded or captured, a staggering loss of manpower that would have broken a lesser nation. In total, the operation resulted in over 8 million casualties by its end, a grim testament to its ferocity. This, however, was only the beginning. The Eastern Front, born from the fires of Barbarossa, would continue its relentless slaughter for 4 years, ultimately resulting in the deaths of more than 26 million people, forever searing its name into history as the site of humanity's most destructive conflict.
What does it mean to be the first to stand against an unstoppable tide? In the pre-dawn stillness of the 22nd of June 1941, the world held its breath on the precipice of a new, terrible chapter of war. This was the day Operation Barbarossa, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, was unleashed, and its very first battle would be fought within the walls of an old fortress, a battle that was supposed to be over in a matter of hours, but would instead become an enduring legend of defiance. At precisely 4:15 Moscow time, the silence over the Brest Fortress was not merely broken, it was annihilated. Without any warning, the German Wehrmacht began a ferocious artillery barrage, a storm of steel and fire designed to sow chaos and crush any thought of resistance before it could form. Among the devastating ordnance were shells from colossal 60-centimeter mortars, weapons intended to pulverize fortifications into dust. The German High Command was confident, expecting to seize Brest on the very first day of their grand invasion, relying solely on the overwhelming shock of their infantry and artillery. They could not have been more wrong. What was planned as a swift surgical strike would devolve into a week-long siege, a brutal testament to human will that would ultimately require 2 separate, devastating bombardments by the Luftwaffe to break. Inside the fortress walls, the sudden cataclysm caught the garrison completely by surprise. Approximately 9,000 Soviet troops were stationed there, a mix of personnel from various rifle brigades, border forces, and artillery units. They were not alone. Living alongside them were about 300 civilian family members, women and children, who were now trapped in the heart of the inferno. Facing this stunned and unprepared garrison was a formidable 20,000-strong Wehrmacht force, poised for a rapid victory. The initial moments of the assault were pure chaos. The defenders, jolted from their sleep by the thunder of explosions, struggled to mount a cohesive defense. They were scattered, their command structure shattered by the surprise bombardment, and they failed to form a solid, unified front against the German infantry pouring into the complex. The German plan appeared to be succeeding with terrifying efficiency. By 9 in the morning, a mere handful of hours after the first shell fell, the fortress was completely surrounded, its connection to the outside world severed. The trap had been sprung. Yet it was at this very moment, when victory seemed assured for the invaders, that the character of the battle began to shift. As the morning wore on, the scattered pockets of Soviet resistance began to stiffen, coalescing from disorganized shock into a furious, stubborn defense. Major General Schlieper, commanding the German 45th Infantry Division, watched the assault bog down and came to a stark realization. The rapid capture he had anticipated was now impossible. The fighting devolved into a nightmarish close-quarter struggle. German platoons and companies, attempting to clear the labyrinthine corridors and courtyards, became hopelessly intermixed with the desperate Soviet defenders. Grand strategy gave way to brutal, intimate combat, where battles were frequently decided not by rifles, but by bayonets, trench tools, and bare hands. The Brest Fortress was now a completely isolated island of resistance, encircled by an enemy that repeatedly called on its defenders to lay down their arms and surrender. The response from within was a resounding, unspoken refusal. The garrison was not giving up. An extraordinary spirit of collective defiance took hold. The women, caught in the siege, took on the vital role of tending to the ever-growing number of wounded, turning cellars into makeshift infirmaries. The children, meanwhile, displayed a courage far beyond their years, becoming indispensable to the defense.
They scavenged for precious ammunition and equipment amidst the rubble, delivered vital messages between isolated pockets of defenders, and crept through the ruins to scout enemy movements, their small size allowing them to navigate the battlefield in ways soldiers could not. The situation was utterly desperate, yet the resolve of the garrison only hardened. They were determined to hold their ground, to make the enemy pay for every inch of soil, and to send a clear message that surrender was simply not an option. The ensuing battle for the Brest Fortress raged for 8 grueling days. For 8 days, the defenders held out against overwhelming odds, with dwindling supplies of food, water, and ammunition. Finally, on the 29th of June, the last major defended part of the fortress was taken by German forces. The main battle was over. In its aftermath, about 6,800 Soviet soldiers and commanders were captured and marched into captivity. But even with the fall of the fortress, the echoes of resistance refused to die. The only documented proof of continued fighting comes from a German report stating that a shootout occurred nearly a month later, on the 23rd of July, 1941. This brief, violent encounter resulted in the subsequent capture of a Soviet lieutenant and Oberleutnant the very next day. It is said that Major Peter Gavrilov, one of the most renowned defenders of the fortress, was among these last holdouts, captured only on that same day, the 23rd of July, an astonishing testament to his endurance. Long after the guns fell silent and the war moved on, another form of testimony was discovered. Scratched into the fortress walls by the doomed defenders, graffiti was found, messages that became iconic symbols of their sacrifice. 2 inscriptions in particular captured the unyielding spirit of the garrison. One simply stated, "We'll die, but we'll not leave the fortress." Another, a final, heartbreaking farewell, read, "I'm dying, but I won't surrender. Farewell, motherland." The 20th of July, 1941. In the years that followed, the story of this desperate 8-day struggle against impossible odds grew into a powerful national symbol of Soviet resistance. The stand at Brest Fortress became a foundational story of courage and sacrifice.
In recognition of this extraordinary defense, the fortress was awarded the prestigious title of Hero Fortress in the year 1965. The transformation from a war-torn ruin into a hallowed ground was completed in 1971, when a huge, solemn memorial was opened on the site. At its heart stands the Museum of the Defense of the Brest Fortress, a place dedicated to preserving the memory of the 9,000 soldiers and 300 civilians who, in the opening hours of a devastating war, chose to fight, to endure, and to die, rather than surrender their home. Was this the moment the unstoppable blitzkrieg finally began to bleed? In the summer of 1941, the world watched in horror as the German war machine tore through the Soviet Union, its armored spearheads seemingly invincible. As part of the colossal invasion codenamed Operation Barbarossa, a pivotal and brutal engagement unfolded, one that would both seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and subtly alter the very course of the Second World War. This was the Battle of Smolensk, a 2-month-long maelstrom of fire and steel that raged from the 10th of July to the 10th of September in the year 1941. On the surface, it would end as another spectacular victory for Nazi Germany and its Axis allies, a crushing defeat for the USSR's Red Army. Yet buried within the ashes of this triumph were the seeds of a catastrophic failure, a delay that would cost the invaders everything. The city of Smolensk, nestled on the banks of the Great Dnieper River, had for centuries been considered the traditional gateway to Moscow. To capture it was to hold the key to the Soviet heartland. The German High Command, masters of the Lightning War, unleashed a classic and devastating strategy to seize this prize. They employed a massive pincer movement, a terrifyingly effective tactic where powerful armored and infantry divisions would slice through the enemy's flanks, driving deep into their rear to encircle and annihilate them. The plan was to trap the bulk of the Red Army forces west of Smolensk, creating a vast cauldron from which there could be no escape. The Soviet soldiers, though fighting with a desperate ferocity, were caught in this deadly embrace. The German advance was relentless, and after days of intense and bloody fighting, the city of Smolensk itself fell into German hands on the 16th of July. The success of the German encirclement was staggering. The twin arms of the pincer closed shut, trapping not just one but elements of up to 6 entire Soviet armies within multiple shrinking pockets of resistance. The battle devolved into a series of brutal struggles as the trapped Soviet forces fought to break out and the Germans fought to liquidate them. The result was a catastrophe for the Red Army. When the smoke finally cleared from the main encirclements, the Germans had taken an almost unimaginable haul of prisoners, counting around 340,000 captured Soviet soldiers. With Smolensk secured and the defending army shattered, the path to the Russian capital seemed wide open.
Moscow was now squarely in the invaders' sights. For the Red Army, the Battle of Smolensk was yet another severe soul-crushing defeat in the disastrous opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, a continuation of the nightmare that had begun in late June. However, something different happened at Smolensk. Amidst the chaos and the collapse, the Soviet command attempted a move of unprecedented scale and audacity. For the very first time since the invasion began, they tried to implement a coordinated counterattack against a large portion of the German front. This was not merely a localized defensive action or a desperate breakout attempt. It was a conscious, strategic effort to seize the initiative and hurl the aggressors back. While this ambitious counteroffensive would ultimately crumble and turn into a military disaster, its significance cannot be overstated. The stiffening resistance, the willingness to organize and strike back on a grand scale, sent a clear and chilling message to the Wehrmacht. It demonstrated that the Soviets, despite their horrific losses, were not yet defeated. It was a bloody premonition that the Blitzkrieg's triumphant march towards Moscow was not going to be the easy undertaking the German leadership had so confidently predicted. The Soviet bear, though grievously wounded, was beginning to show its claws. In the final accounting, the battle was an undeniable tactical victory for Germany. The capture of Smolensk provided them with critical supplies and vastly improved their logistical position for the final push toward the capital. The failure of the Soviet counteroffensive had also starkly highlighted the significant weaknesses in the Red Army's military strategy and command structure, forcing a painful process of strategic reassessment that would bear fruit in the years to come. The human cost for the Soviet Union was almost beyond comprehension. Soviet casualties totaled approximately 760,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. This horrific figure was a grim reflection of the Red Army state at the time, possessing a vast numerical superiority in manpower, but a clear and fatal tactical inferiority against the seasoned and brilliantly led German forces. Yet the victory came at a price that the Germans could ill afford to pay. The battle was one of savage attrition, chewing up men and machines at an alarming rate. German losses reached about 250,000 casualties, a staggering number that exacerbated the exhaustion of Army Group Center, the primary force tasked with capturing Moscow. More important than the loss of men, however, was the loss of time. The fierce Soviet resistance and the protracted operations to clear the encircled pockets had postponed the German timetable for the assault on Moscow by up to 2 critical months. This delay, purchased with the blood of over 750,000 Soviet soldiers, proved to be a strategic masterstroke, however unintentional. Those 2 months gave the Soviets a precious window to partially reconstitute their shattered defenses before the capital. It was a delay that pushed the final German offensive, Operation Typhoon, into the autumn, allowing the infamous Russian winter to become a decisive factor in the war. The Wehrmacht's ultimate failure to seize the Soviet capital before the snows fell can be causally linked back to the time lost in the brutal grinding fight for Smolensk, the gateway to Moscow that had become a graveyard of German ambition.
What does it mean to witness the largest military encirclement in the history of warfare? In the sweltering summer and early autumn of the year 1941, the world would find out in the fields and forests surrounding the ancient city of Kiev. The battle, a brutal and sprawling engagement that raged from the 7th of July until the 26th of September, culminated in a disaster of such epic proportions for the Soviet Red Army that its scale remains difficult to comprehend even decades later. It was not merely a defeat, it was a cataclysm that resulted in the complete annihilation of a massive strategic formation, a tragedy that would be forever etched into the annals of military history as a singular moment of unparalleled catastrophe. The entire operational strength of the Southwestern Front, a colossal army group commanded by Mikhail Karponos and tasked with defending a vast swath of territory, was systematically trapped, broken, and ultimately consumed by the German war machine. The human cost of this monumental failure was staggering, a testament to the sheer ferocity of the fighting and the utter hopelessness of the situation for the encircled troops. Official records paint a grim picture of the Southwestern Front's fate, tallying a horrifying total of 700,544 casualties. This immense figure, however, masks an even more devastating reality. Within that number, a staggering 616,304 soldiers were listed as killed, captured, or missing in action, men who were effectively erased from the Red Army's order of battle in a matter of weeks. The mechanism of this destruction was the vast encirclement, a tightening ring of steel that trapped an incredible 452,700 Soviet soldiers within its suffocating embrace. For these men, the battle transformed from a conventional fight into a desperate struggle for survival against impossible odds. The completeness of their entrapment is starkly illustrated by the number of those who managed to break free. By the 2nd of October, after the pocket had been fully liquidated, a mere 15,000 soldiers had successfully escaped the cauldron. The rest were condemned to death on the battlefield or to the grim fate of a prisoner of war. This was not the loss of a few divisions or a single corps, it was the wholesale destruction of entire armies. The Soviet 5th, 37th, 26th, 21st, and 38th armies, comprising a formidable force of 43 full divisions, were for all practical purposes annihilated. These were not just numbers on a map, but vast organizations of men and materiel, each an army in its own right, and their collective demise left a gaping void in the Soviet defensive line that seemed impossible to fill. The contagion of defeat spread even to adjacent units, as the 40th Army, positioned on the periphery of the main encirclement, also suffered immensely heavy and debilitating losses in the chaotic aftermath. The very structure of the Red Army in the south had been shattered, its command decapitated, and its fighting strength bled white. The sheer scale of the Soviet losses is corroborated by the records of their adversaries. German military accounts from the period indicate that approximately 665,000 Soviet troops were taken as prisoners of war, a figure that chillingly aligns with the Soviet casualty reports. Another source confirms this staggering number, stating that German estimates claimed 665,000 prisoners were captured by the time the immense task of clearing the wreckage of the battlefield was finally completed. Even Soviet admissions, while slightly more conservative, acknowledged the breathtaking scope of the disaster. They conceded the loss of 4 complete field armies, the destruction of 43 divisions, and the capture or death of 452,720 soldiers. Decades later, with the benefit of hindsight and access to previously sealed archives, the true toll became even clearer. According to data published in the year 1993 by the General Headquarters of the Russian Armed Forces, the total Soviet losses in the Kiev operation exceeded 700,000 people. Of this number, a truly heartbreaking 627,800 were classified as irretrievable losses, a bureaucratic term for the dead and the missing who would never return. The Great Battle of Encirclement that defined the months of August and September of 1941 had cost the Soviets a figure estimated at approximately 450,000 casualties in that period alone. The Kiev Pocket, as it came to be known, was a graveyard not only for men, but also for the very concept of the Red Army's Southwestern Front, which was utterly defeated and its remnants captured. In this single operation, 4 Soviet armies were completely destroyed, while 2 more were so badly mauled that they were rendered combat ineffective. Beyond the catastrophic loss of personnel, the material cost was equally devastating, stripping the Red Army of its capacity to wage war in the sector. An incredible 411 tanks and self-propelled guns, the armored fist of the Soviet forces, were lost to the enemy. The skies were also swept clear of Soviet presence, with the loss of 343 aircraft. Perhaps most crippling of all was the loss of artillery, the backbone of Soviet military doctrine. An almost unbelievable 28,419 guns and mortars fell into German hands or were destroyed, silencing the batteries that were supposed to defend the motherland and leaving the surviving infantrymen with the fire support they so desperately needed. It was, in every measurable sense, a defeat of historic and catastrophic proportions. What does it take to erase a city from the face of the earth? For 872 agonizing days, the world witnessed an attempt to answer that very question. Beginning on the 8th of September 1941 and not concluding until the 27th of January 1944, the siege of Leningrad became a testament to human suffering and resilience on a scale that defies comprehension. This prolonged agony, sometimes referred to as the 900-day siege, was not a mere consequence of war, but a calculated act of annihilation orchestrated by German and Finnish forces. A secret directive issued by Hitler himself laid bare the chilling objective. St. Petersburg must be erased from the face of the earth. The document was explicit in its disregard for human life, stating with cold finality that there was no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. This was not to be a battle for territory, but a deliberate campaign to extinguish a metropolis and everyone within it through starvation, exposure, and relentless bombardment. The encirclement was swift and absolute, severing the city from the outside world and beginning a slow, methodical descent into hell. The disruption of utilities, water, energy, and most critically, food supplies was immediate and catastrophic. The supply situation was already dire when the iron ring of the blockade snapped shut, with warehouses nearly empty. The man responsible for managing the city's dwindling reserves, Dmitry Pavlov, was faced with an impossible task and was forced to make a series of drastic reductions to the food ration, a decision that would sentence hundreds of thousands to a slow death. The first winter, arriving in 1941 and stretching into 1942, was the crucible in which the city's fate was forged. It was a winter of unprecedented, brutal cold, with temperatures regularly plunging to -20 degrees Celsius and at times reaching an unfathomable -40 degrees Celsius. In this landscape of ice and despair, the city's lifeblood froze and then shattered. The water and electricity supply systems failed completely, plunging Leningrad into a primitive darkness. The transport network ceased to function, rendering the city a collection of isolated, frozen islands. For the starving inhabitants, this paralysis was a death sentence. Even the short distance of a few kilometers to a food distribution kiosk became an insurmountable obstacle, an epic journey across a frozen wasteland that many were too weak to complete. To survive the lethal cold, people burned anything they could find: furniture, books, floorboards, turning their homes into hollowed-out shells and sparking numerous fires that consumed the very structures they were trying to warm. Amidst this Arctic nightmare, the specter of famine grew into a monstrous reality. From November of 1941 to February of 1942, the only food available to the average citizen was a daily ration of 125 grams of bread. This was not bread as one would know it. It was a gritty, barely edible substance of which 50 to 60% consisted of sawdust, wallpaper dust, and other inedible admixtures. This pathetic portion, providing a meager 500 calories, was all that stood between a person and starvation. The human body, forced to subsist on such fare, began to consume itself. People ate whatever they could get their hands on, boiling leather belts and shoes to create a gelatinous broth, scraping wallpaper paste from walls for its supposed potato flour content, and consuming cosmetics. The city's pets vanished, consumed by desperate owners. In the darkest corners of the city, persistent and horrifying rumors of cannibalism began to circulate, a final taboo broken by the unendurable pangs of hunger. Death became a constant, mundane presence on the streets of Leningrad. The peak of the mortality crisis arrived in January and February of 1942, when an estimated 100,000 people perished each month, the vast majority from starvation. Citizens grew accustomed to the sight of bodies lying frozen in the snow where they had fallen, their emaciated forms a common feature of the urban landscape. The living, too weak to bury the dead, simply stepped around them. The city of 2.5 million inhabitants that had stood proudly on the eve of the conflict was being systematically hollowed out. Yet, even in the depths of this abyss, a flicker of life remained. A precarious lifeline was established across the vast frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga. During the brief summer months, sparse supplies of food and fuel reached the besieged city by barge, navigating treacherous waters under the constant threat of air attack. In the winter, the lake's thick ice became the road of life, a desperate highway for trucks and ice-borne sleds. This fragile connection was just enough to keep the city's vital arms factories operating and its remaining population of 2 million people barely alive through the horrific year of 1942. It was also an escape route, allowing for the evacuation of 1 million of the city's most vulnerable, its children, its sick, and its elderly, ferrying them away from the epicenter of the famine. The sheer scale of the human loss is staggering. In the single year of 1942, the blockade and siege claimed the lives of 650,000 Leningraders, who succumbed to starvation, disease, exposure, and the shells that rained down from distant German artillery. The total death toll is estimated to be around 800,000 people, with cold and hunger being the primary executioners. Some historical estimates place the total human losses, factoring in both civilian and military casualties, at a catastrophic 1.5 million. When the siege was finally broken, the city was a ghost of its former self. Of the 2.5 million people who had called Leningrad home before the war, only 600,000 were still alive within its limits to witness the liberation. The end came in January of 1944.
After 872 days of unimaginable suffering, a successful Soviet offensive finally managed to drive the German forces westward, pushing them away from the city's outskirts and shattering the blockade. The siege was over. The city of Leningrad had not been erased from the face of the earth, but it bore scars that would never fully heal, a permanent memorial to a time when an entire population was condemned to die, yet somehow, against all odds, endured. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? In the autumn of 1941, the world watched as the seemingly invincible German war machine, having blitzed its way across Europe, arrived at the very gates of Moscow. The grand strategic offensive, codenamed Operation Typhoon and launched on the 30th of September 1941, was meant to be the final decisive blow that would shatter the Soviet Union. Yet, before the spires of the Kremlin, this formidable force did not just slow, it froze, broke, and was thrown back. The advance was not halted by a single fortress or a lone army, but by a trinity of relentless adversaries: the unforgiving Russian landscape, the catastrophic collapse of its own supply lines, and a resurgent Soviet resistance that rose from what the Germans believed were ashes. The first signs of trouble were not heralded by the roar of cannons, but by the whisper of falling snow and the squelch of mud. As the German offensive pressed on, the very earth seemed to rise up in defiance. On the 7th of October, the first snow of the season fell, a picturesque dusting that quickly melted into a treacherous morass. This transformed the primitive Russian roads and vast open fields into deep, clinging quagmires of mud. This phenomenon, known in Russia as the Rasputitsa, is a season of profound impassability, when the land itself becomes a barrier. For the mechanized German armored groups, which relied on speed and mobility, it was a paralyzing nightmare. Tanks and trucks sank to their axles, supply columns stretched for miles, and the lightning pace of the blitzkrieg slowed to a grueling crawl. This unexpected quagmire became an unwitting ally to the Red Army, granting its beleaguered forces precious time to fall back, regroup, and fortify their defenses around the capital. The struggle was felt acutely across the entire front. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Army's drive towards the strategic city of Tula was choked not only by the appalling weather, but also by dwindling fuel supplies and the wreckage of damaged roads and bridges left in the wake of the Soviet retreat. An initial desperate assault on Tula was bloodily repelled on the 29th of October by a determined mix of the Soviet 50th Army and hastily assembled units of civilian volunteers, a testament to the stiffening resolve of the defenders. The situation had become so untenable that by the 31st of October, the German Army High Command issued a stark order. All offensive operations were to be halted. The war machine had to pause, not to celebrate victory, but to grapple with logistical problems that had spiraled out of control, and to wait for the very ground beneath their feet to solidify. This pause revealed the deep wounds the campaign had already inflicted upon the German army. By late October, the forces arrayed before Moscow were a shadow of the triumphant legions that had crossed the border months earlier. They were utterly worn out. A staggering 2/3 of their motor vehicles were no longer functional, victims of the brutal conditions and a lack of maintenance. The truck situation was particularly dire. Of the 600,000 transport vehicles that had begun the invasion, a mere 75,000 remained serviceable. Infantry divisions, the backbone of any army, were reduced to skeletal formations, operating at a third to half of their original strength. Compounding this physical decay was a critical failure in logistics. As the Rasputitsa gave way to frost, the German soldiers found themselves facing a new, more lethal enemy without the means to fight it. Simple necessities like warm clothing and essential winter equipment were stuck hundreds of miles behind the front, unable to traverse the ruined supply lines. Then General Winter arrived in his full, terrible majesty. The European winter of 1941 to 1942 was not merely cold, it was the coldest of the entire 20th century, a period of historic, bone-shattering frost. As the Germans managed to push their exhausted troops to the very outskirts of Moscow, they were met by this Arctic onslaught. On the 30th of November, the temperature was reported to have plunged to a staggering -45 degrees Celsius, which is equivalent to -49 degrees Fahrenheit. For soldiers clad in summer uniforms, this was a death sentence. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were officially reported among the German ranks, a figure that scarcely captures the full extent of the suffering. The cold was an indiscriminate weapon, attacking not just the men but their machines as well. Grease on every loaded artillery shell froze solid and had to be painstakingly scraped off before it could be fired. Engines refused to turn over, and vehicles had to be heated for hours with open fires before they could even be used. The German army was quite literally freezing in its tracks, all while facing the fierce and unyielding resistance of Soviet defenders, who were now being bolstered by fresh elite troops arriving from the vastness of Siberia, soldiers who were born and bred in such extreme conditions. The final, decisive halt came on the 4th of December. The great German advance on Moscow was over, but for the Soviets, this was not an end, but a beginning. The very next day, on the 5th of December, the Red Army launched a massive, unexpected counteroffensive. German intelligence had confidently and catastrophically estimated that the Soviet forces had no more reserves to commit to the fight. They could not have been more wrong. In a masterful strategic maneuver, Stalin had transferred immense power from the east, moving over 18 battle-hardened divisions, 1,700 tanks, and more than 1,500 aircraft from Siberia and the Far East, regions they now knew were safe from Japanese attack. By the beginning of December, the Red Army had secretly accumulated a strategic reserve of 58 divisions. The blow when it landed was overwhelming.
The counteroffensive, prepared and directed by the brilliant General Georgy Zhukov, began on the 5th of December 1941 on the Kalinin front. The following day, the western and southwestern fronts joined the assault, creating a vast coordinated attack that smashed into the brittle German lines. The exhausted, frozen, and demoralized German soldiers were completely unprepared. The Soviet offensive tumbled them back, lapped around their flanks, and threatened entire armies with encirclement, producing a crisis of the highest order for the German command. The illusion of inevitable victory was shattered in the Russian snow. In Berlin, the shock was palpable. On the 8th of December, Adolf Hitler signed his Directive No. 39, an order that signaled a monumental shift in the war. The Wehrmacht was to cease its offensive and assume a defensive stance across the entire front. Even this proved difficult.
The German troops were in such a state of disarray that they were unable to organize a solid defense at their forward locations and were forced into a painful, costly retreat simply to consolidate their lines and avoid complete annihilation. The great drive on Moscow had failed, brought to ruin by the mud, the ice, a logistical nightmare, and an enemy who refused to break. From the launch of Operation Barbarossa to the battles of Brest, Smolensk, Kiev, the siege of Leningrad, and the stand at Moscow, we've explored how one massive invasion reshaped the course of World War II and changed history forever. If you found this series useful, don't forget to support the channel. Hit like, subscribe for more history content, and feel free to share your thoughts or questions in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.